I can remember a time when I was a lot younger when the weather would turn mild and it became quite normal for people my age and younger and sometimes considerably older to stop wearing shoes and socks all the time and just go around barefoot, as I'm doing right now. And there always have been certain dangers associated with walking around in your bare feet. You know, there are puncture wounds and lacerations that can happen. You kind of have to watch where you're going because there are certain dangers, and walking on hard gravel isn't necessarily the best idea. Here in the Southwest, I don't really advise people walking around barefoot at night that much because there are certain dangers here. We have all kinds of plant life that is sticky and prickly, and there are also dangers with poisonous snakes and scorpions and a lot of things that can get you in trouble if you walk around outdoors barefoot at night. But it was for a long time just a completely normal thing to do, just like short sleeve shirts and shorts, and nobody thought anything about it. Well, over time this began to acquire some kind of social stigma, and not for any good reason that I can think of. The most common objection to people walking around barefoot is that people think it's unsanitary. You can see signs on the doors of various businesses that say shirts and shoes required because of health department regulations. But in fact, in the United States, there are virtually no state or local laws or health regulations against people walking around barefoot. Why would there be? Because it is extremely unlikely for any infectious disease to be passed from person to person because someone was going barefoot. That is extremely unusual. You would almost have to have a couple of people with open wounds wrestling outside for that to even be a threat. You certainly can't get coronavirus or anything like that by walking barefoot, and you can't get most infectious diseases that way, hardly any that I know of. So there are in the United States virtually no laws or health codes against going barefoot. It is also perfectly legal to drive barefoot. In fact, you have better control that way. At least I do, and I do that pretty frequently. Now, the thing about rules and regulations is that businesses are free to set their own policies. They can bar people going in without shoes if they want to. But there's no legal basis, there are no health codes against doing it because bare feet don't spread disease. It is extremely unlikely for that to happen. It is extremely unlikely to get ringworm from that unless you happen to be walking in certain shady, moist places. Most of the time, that's not an issue at all. So this idea that being barefoot is unsanitary, that is just ridiculous. It is virtually unheard of for infectious disease to be transmitted from person to person that way. What other objection is there? Well, for some people, in some people's minds, bare feet are associated with poverty, and that is just completely absurd. Because people do that not because of poverty, but because it's just more comfortable. You see celebrities doing that even on stage a lot. So that objection is just completely ridiculous. It doesn't hold at all. In fact, if you go around without shoes as much as possible, it's actually much better for your feet, and it actually does provide some stress relief. It just feels better, kind of like wearing short sleeves or shorts. And the risks are to the one doing it. There are risks to a barefoot person from injury, but most of that you can get around just by being careful where you look, where you go. And there's not really a risk at all. Now, there are places where it's out of place and inappropriate. Formal occasions, usually church, medical offices, banks, most business meetings, not all, but most business meetings, there are places where it's just not okay to be barefoot for some pretty good reasons. There are places where it's not okay. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm some kind of nutty extremist like this. I'm not one of these people who insist on going barefoot all over the place all the time. That is ridiculous. I have several pair of shoes, a pair of casuals, a pair of sneakers, a pair of dress shoes, and some cowboy boots that I use all the time, but I don't wear them when it's not necessary. I'm not one who is inclined to push the limits and go barefoot in places where it's going to cause problems or be a source of controversy, because that is not something I want to argue about. In a lot of retail stores, I'll get around that in mild weather by going in flip-flops. I don't walk a lot in those because it's bad if you're going to do a lot of walking, but sometimes I will do that. But I'm not an extremist about it. For some reason, we have this ridiculous idea about footwear being required all the time, and it's just completely ridiculous to be so strict about that. It makes no sense at all to be so strict about it. Matter of fact, shoes or footwear of any kind are not required here in my home. There's not a rule against it per se, but it's perfectly normal to take shoes off on coming inside here, lots of other places as far as I'm concerned. But I do have several pair, and I wear them a lot. I use them every day. I don't wear them necessarily here in the office facility part of our building because it's a clean and comfortable carpeted environment in the office part, and we don't have a lot of outside visitors, and we don't need the footwear in here, so we just generally don't use it typically. That's not a universal rule for all people all the time, but it's just a lot more comfortable, and it cuts stress. Now, I guess some people have some other fears or phobias about it that are not associated with danger or the potential for infectious disease, which is extremely rare. It virtually never happens. But to those people, I would say that irrational fears and phobias about people walking around bare feet are abnormal and weird, and people just need to get over it, because the threat of spreading infectious disease that way is virtually non-existent in clean and developed countries. So now that it's become milder weather, I'm going to be wearing shoes and sometimes socks a lot less. It depends on where I am. As I said, I'm not big on going barefoot outside at night in the Southwest because there are certain dangers here. But I certainly will down to the local convenience store or for a beer run or something like that. I'll do that without shoes. There's no reason not to, as long as I go in the daytime. There are certain dangers at night. But apart from the infectious disease threat, which basically doesn't exist, and apart from danger to the person themselves, other fears and phobias about people going barefoot are just absurd and abnormal, and people really should just get over them. If it doesn't make sense, and this fear or phobia generally doesn't most of the time, people should just get over it. And as I mentioned, I'm not an extremist, but in mild weather I'll be going without shoes a lot more because it just makes perfect sense. Have a very good day.